Every fortress that looks impregnable hides one fatal weak point. For Vladimir Putin's empire, that weak point was never on the front line. It was never in the trenches of the Donbas or the minefields of Zaporizhzhia, where the world keeps staring. It runs through something quieter: the pipelines, the pumping stations, the refineries, and the long fuel trains that nobody puts on the evening news. The machinery that turns crude oil into diesel, into jet fuel, into the money that pays a soldier's bonus and builds the next missile. For 4 years, Russia called itself unstoppable, the largest army in Europe, a war chest 2 decades in the making. And for 15 months, much of the West agreed. Even the President of the United States told Ukraine to its face in front of the cameras that it had already lost. But a fortress does not die from a single blade through the heart. It dies from one artery opened quietly in the dark, bleeding a little more every night until the blood runs out faster than the body can make it. Tonight, that artery is wide open. So let's trace exactly where Russia is bleeding and why this time the wound may not close. To understand how far Russia has fallen, you first have to understand how high it once stood, because the fall only makes sense against the height. When Vladimir Putin sent his columns toward Kyiv in February of 2022, he did not do it from weakness. He did it from one of the strongest macroeconomic positions of any major power on the planet. Russia's federal debt stood at roughly 15% of its economy, a number the United States, Japan, and every large European government could only envy. Its sovereign wealth fund, the National Wealth Fund, held hundreds of billions of dollars built from 2 decades of oil and gas surpluses. Inflation was tame. The ruble was steady. For 20 years, Putin had engineered something very specific: a fortress economy designed from the ground up to absorb exactly the kind of Western financial punishment everyone in Moscow knew would follow a war against a Western-aligned neighbor. The sanctions were supposed to break against these walls. For a long time they did. The military picture looked just as commanding. Russia fielded the largest army in Europe. It sat on the world's third-largest oil refining system with so much built-in surplus that analysts assumed it could lose entire plants and barely feel it. It was the second-largest oil exporter on Earth. Oil and gas were not simply an industry. They were the bloodstream of the entire state. The money that bought the shells, paid the contract soldiers, and kept the home front quiet. And on the battlefield, after a string of gains the year before, Russian troops kept grinding forward in the east foot by foot around hubs like Pokrovsk, paying in blood for every shattered village, but moving the line in their direction. And the world noticed. More precisely, the world concluded that Ukraine was finished. The clearest moment came 15 months ago. On the 28th of February 2025, in the Oval Office in front of the cameras, the President of the United States and his Vice President publicly dressed down Ukraine's leader. Donald Trump told Volodymyr Zelensky flatly that he did not have the cards. He told him he was gambling with World War III. He told him, "Make a deal, or we are out, and if we are out, you will fight it out," and he did not think it would be pretty. J.D. Vance accused Zelensky of being disrespectful and ungrateful, of failing to say thank you. The planned signing of a minerals deal was scrapped. The joint press conference was canceled. Zelensky's motorcade left the White House early. As the Washington Post's editorial board would later put it, in an Oval Office tantrum that will live in infamy, the American president had effectively ordered Ukraine to surrender. That was the verdict. Ukraine had no cards. Russia held all of them. The fortress was too big, too rich, too deep to fail. The only real question, the smart money said, was how fast Kyiv would be forced to sign away its land. Hold that picture in your mind, because almost none of it survived contact with the next 15 months. Here is what the smart money missed. A fortress is only as strong as the thing it was built to survive. Putin's fortress was engineered to withstand a financial siege from the outside, from Washington, from Brussels, from their banks, and their sanctions lists. It was never designed to survive a different kind of siege, one that does not come through the front gate at all, but climbs over the walls, slips past. The army reaches deep into the rear and opens the single artery the entire structure depends on to keep breathing. It was built to be starved slowly. It was never built to be bled. And every fortress that looks impregnable has one fatal weak point. For Russia, that weak point was the oil, the refineries, the fuel, the bloodstream itself. While the world kept staring at the trenches, Ukraine quietly built the one weapon that could reach that artery from hundreds of miles away. And then, methodically, night after night, it started cutting. 15 months after a U.S. president looked Ukraine in the eye and told it the war was already lost, the data tells a story almost nobody predicted. It is not Ukraine that is bleeding out on the table. It is the fortress. So let's go layer by layer and follow the blood. Start with a wound everyone can see: the front line. For most of this war, the story was simple and grim. Russia pushed, Ukraine bled. The map crept east. But look at the map now, and something has broken. The Institute for the Study of War, the most cited battlefield tracker in Washington, reports that Ukraine's long-range strikes have slowed Russian battlefield gains to almost zero. The Associated Press reporting from the ground describes Russian advances along the more than 1,000-kilometer front grinding to a near halt while Ukraine launches successful counterstrikes. After a year of momentum, the giant has stopped moving. And here is the part that should stop you cold. It has stopped moving while paying the highest price of the entire war. By December of 2025, British military intelligence put Russia's killed and wounded at more than 1 million, somewhere around 1.2 million men. The Center for Strategic and International Studies reached a similar figure, with anywhere from 1/4 to 500,000 of them killed, depending on which Western estimate you believe. At the peak of the meat grinder assaults around Pokrovsk, Russia was losing more than 1,200 men a day. 1,200 a day to move a line that is no longer moving. That is not the math of a winning army. That is the first visible sign of a body that has started to bleed faster than it can heal. And the bleeding is not only in the dead. British intelligence notes that the sheer number of wounded, many with multiple injuries, is overwhelming Russia's military medical system and deepening its manpower shortage. To keep the assaults going at all, Moscow has leaned harder and harder on cash bonuses and on recruiting foreigners. Ukrainian intelligence reports the Kremlin planning to sign up a record number of foreign nationals into its army in 2026. An army that has to import strangers to fill its trenches is not an army at the height of its power. It is an army quietly running out of its own people. But the front is only the wound you are meant to look at. The real cut is happening somewhere else entirely. For most of this war, the deep Russian interior was the safest real estate on the planet. The refineries, the air bases, the fuel depots, all sat hundreds, even thousands of miles behind the fighting. Untouchable, comfortable, certain. That certainty is gone. Ukraine has built an entire generation of long-range strike drones, and the reach is staggering. In February of 2026, Ukrainian forces hit the Ukhta oil refinery in the Komi Republic more than 1,000 miles inside Russia, roughly 1,700 kilometers from the border. The Lyuty drone can carry explosives as far as 2,000 kilometers from a hidden launch site. The refineries at Ufa, around 1,400 kilometers away, have been struck. And this is not a handful of boutique weapons. Ukraine has driven its long-range drone production into the tens of thousands per year, with newer, disposable models rolling off the lines at around 100 a day. The safe zone has become a death zone. There is no longer a corner of Russia too deep to reach. Before we follow the next cut, one quick thing. If you want to keep tracking how this war is actually being decided, far from the front-page headlines, and the trench footage, consider subscribing. The maps, the math, and the targets shift every single week, and the real story is almost never where the cameras are pointed. With that said, let's get to the artery itself. Because the drones are not hitting random targets. They are hitting the one system the entire Russian state is built on, the oil. This is the heart of it. Since February of 2022, Ukraine has carried out more than 150 separate strikes against Russian oil refineries, and it has now hit 24 of the country's 33 major facilities. The cumulative effect is no longer a nuisance. It is structural. Analysts estimate the campaign has knocked out roughly 1/4 of Russia's refining capacity. In May of 2026, Reuters reported that nearly every major refinery in central Russia had been forced to shut down or cut production plants, representing more than 80 million tons of annual capacity, about 1/4 of the national total, responsible together for more than 30% of Russia's gasoline and 1/4 of its diesel. Moscow's own refinery, Ryazan-Syzran in the Samara region, the giant complex at Kstovo, all forced offline at one point or another. And crucially, Ukraine is no longer striking once and moving on. The Atlantic Council notes the campaign has turned methodical, with the same targets bombed again and again. The Tuapse oil terminal alone was struck 4 separate times in just 2 weeks. You do not let a wound clot if your strategy is to keep reopening it. Zelensky himself has called these refinery hits the most effective sanctions. There are the ones that work the fastest. He has a point. A sanctions package takes months of negotiation in Brussels and can be quietly dodged through middlemen and shadow tankers. A burning distillation tower cannot be negotiated with, and it cannot be smuggled around. Now follow what that does to the money, because this is where a refinery fire stops being a headline and becomes a hole in the war chest. Russia does not fight on courage. It fights on petrodollars. Oil and gas revenue is the bloodstream that pays for the shells, the bonuses, and the drones. And that bloodstream is draining. The strikes have forced Russia to do something almost unthinkable for a petrostate to ban its own exports of diesel and aviation fuel, hoarding at home what it can no longer reliably produce. Output had to be diverted to distant ports on the Baltic and the Barents Sea just to keep moving. Russian oil processing fell from about 5.4 million barrels a day down toward 5 million within 2 months. One analysis put the running cost to Putin's government at $100 million a day. Now, an honest word here, because this matters. This is not collapse by tomorrow morning. Russia still operates the world's third-largest refining system, with real surplus capacity, and skeptical analysts at CEPA point out that 6 months of refinery strikes cost Russia somewhere around $863 million against the roughly $189 billion it earned from oil exports in 2024. One night of fire does not end a war, but that misses the direction of travel. The strikes are accelerating, they are repeated. They are stacking on top of Western sanctions and a shrinking export market all at once. The artery is not severed in a single cut. It is being opened a little wider every week. And the blood loss does not stay on a spreadsheet in Moscow. It reaches the gas station. This is the part Putin most wanted to hide. To plug the gap, Russia has been forced to ban its own exports of gasoline and diesel, and even to dip into emergency reserves to keep the wheels turning. A source inside Ukraine's security service, the SBU, claimed that nearly 40% of Russian refining capacity was already sitting idle because of the strike campaign. Tatiana Mitrova of Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy put it plainly. Even a 10% cut, she said, is something that starts to be felt as a Russian domestic fuel crisis, as reduced exports of refined products, as rising tension inside the oil sector itself. Translate that out of analyst language, and it means lines at fuel stations. It means farmers and truckers and ordinary Russians far from any front suddenly discovering that the war they were told was almost won has reached into their own fuel tanks. And to move the oil it can still sell, Russia has been forced to reroute it through distant ports on the Baltic and the Barents Sea, longer routes, higher costs, more exposure, simply because the closer Black Sea terminals at Tuapse and Novorossiysk keep going up in flames. The artery does not just feed the army. It feeds the entire country. And it is the entire country that is beginning to feel the loss. And here is the detail that makes the whole thing unwinnable for Moscow. The cost of the blade versus the cost of the wound. A Russian refinery is worth hundreds of millions, sometimes billions of dollars. The drone that sets it on fire can cost as little as $55,000 for a disposable long-range model, around $200,000 for a Lyuti, perhaps $270,000 for the most commonly used strategic drone. At the cheap end, an FPV drone runs as little as $400, and $400 drones have been destroying multi-million-dollar tanks and air defense systems for years. Think about that exchange rate. Ukraine spends the price of a used car to threaten an asset worth more than a skyscraper. Russia, meanwhile, burns through expensive interceptors trying to swat them down. A single modern air defense missile can cost over $1 million, and the most advanced Western-style interceptors run into the millions apiece. No state on earth can afford to ring every refinery, every depot, every pumping station across 11 time zones with hardware that expensive. Moscow has to choose what to protect, and in choosing it leaves everything else exposed. Ukraine gets to pick the gap. Russia has to defend all of it everywhere all at once forever. This is the cruel arithmetic that has turned Russia's greatest asset, its sheer enormous size, into its greatest liability. The bigger the fortress, the more wall there is to defend, and the more artery there is to cut. Every refinery, every depot, every pumping station is now a target that costs Ukraine almost nothing to threaten and costs Russia a fortune to protect. That is not a war Russia is winning. That is a war whose math runs against it a little more with every passing night. But a bleeding artery is only the beginning, because once the blood stops reaching the rest of the body, things start to fail much further from the battlefield than Moscow ever planned for. Because once the artery is bleeding, the damage stops being military and starts being national. And this is where Putin's fortress begins to fail in the one place it was never built to fail, from the inside. Start with the budget, the clearest measure of how far Russia has traveled. Moscow's 2026 budget pours the equivalent of around $238 billion into defense and security, nearly 40% of all government spending. Sit with that number. Roughly 40 cents of every ruble the Russian state spends now goes to the war. And every one of those rubles is a ruble that does not go to roads, to hospitals, to schools, to the ordinary economy a country needs to grow. The war is not just being fought at the front. It is being subtracted every single day from the lives of the people back home. The bill shows up first as inflation. Wartime spending overheated the economy so badly that the Bank of Russia was forced to raise its key interest rate to a record 21% in October of 2024. It has since walked that rate back down to 14.5% by late April of 2026. But do not mistake those cuts for good news. The central bank is not easing because it won the war on inflation, which is still running well above 8%. It is easing because the economy is grinding to a halt, and a stalling economy is the one thing rate cuts cannot truly cure. Now lay the bleeding artery back on top: oil and gas revenue. The lifeblood we just watched burn has fallen by more than a quarter. At the same moment, the cost of simply servicing Russia's debt has more than doubled as a share of the economy since before the war. Russia's own finance minister warned in a February letter that war spending is on course to blow through the 2026 budget by tens of billions of dollars, and that the country may have to freeze spending elsewhere just to keep the war funded. The economy minister went further still, publicly admitting Russia is on the brink of recession. The Moscow Times concluded that the country has burned through the temporary fuel that propped up its wartime economy and is now sliding from a managed slowdown into outright stagnation with no real recovery, likely before 2027, and only then if the war ends. But money problems can sometimes be patched. The next wound cannot, because the deepest crisis Russia faces is the one no amount of oil money can buy its way out of: people. Russia was running out of working-age citizens before the first shot was ever fired. The war has made it catastrophic. By the end of 2024, Russian companies were short roughly 2.2 million workers, with nearly 70% of firms reporting they could not find enough staff. The country's own labor minister told Putin it will need close to 11 million additional workers by the end of the decade just to stand still. And the pipeline of new people is collapsing. In 2024, Russian births fell to about 1.2 million, the lowest since 1999, while deaths climbed to 1.8 million. The fertility rate sits near 1.4 children per woman, far below the level a nation needs simply to replace itself. The war has killed or maimed a huge share of a generation of young men and driven roughly 1 million more out of the country entirely. There is no recruitment bonus, no oil windfall, no clever decree that can conjure back a generation that was never born. And in perhaps the most telling move of all, Russia's own statistics agency simply stopped publishing its monthly population data. A government that hides its own numbers is a government that has already decided the truth is politically unbearable. Put it all together and you see why this moment is different from every economic scare Russia has weathered before. The fortress economy Putin spent 20 years building was designed to survive exactly one thing: a financial siege from the West. It was never built to survive a financial siege, a manpower collapse, a dying birth rate, a war eating 40% of the budget, and a revenue base burning down all at the very same time. And the fear has now reached the capital itself. On the most muted victory day in decades, Moscow blacked out its own internet, terrified that Ukrainian drones might reach into the heart of the city. Putin is imposing Iran-style controls on the web, walling his own people off from the outside world. A man who built his entire legitimacy on stability and rising living standards is now boxing in his citizens and bracing for discontent at home. The siege he was so sure he was immune to has arrived. It simply came from a direction he never thought to armor. So here is where the fortress stands. For 4 years, Putin guarded his walls, but the walls were never the weak point. The artery was. The blade he drove into his neighbor has turned in his own hand, and the empire that called itself unstoppable is now bleeding from a wound it can neither close nor hide. The question is no longer whether Russia can win. The data already answered that. The real question is darker. When a fortress bleeds from the inside, how does it choose to fall? If this is how you like to follow a war, then stay close. The next cut is already coming.